The late afternoon sun, already beginning its slow dip towards the jagged silhouette of the city skyline, cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of Glenview Park. Elias Vance, his hands stained with earth and the scent of freshly cut grass clinging to his worn denim shirt, paused his work, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused knuckle. He was meticulous, each blade of grass trimmed to perfect uniformity, each rosebush pruned with an artist's care. This park, particularly this quiet corner with its ancient oak and weathered stone benches, was a small sanctuary, not just for the residents of the upscale neighborhood that bordered it, but for him too. It was a place where the quiet hum of his labor felt like a prayer, a testament to honest work in a world that often felt too loud, too fast. He caught sight of Mrs. Gable, a familiar figure on her usual bench, a book resting unread in her lap, her gaze soft as she watched a pair of squirrels chase each other up the oak. He offered a small, respectful nod, which she returned with a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Their interactions were always brief, wordless acknowledgments of shared space, yet a sense of quiet fellowship had grown between them over the seasons. The tranquility was shattered by the harsh growl of an engine and the abrupt squeal of tires. A police cruiser, stark blue and white against the park's verdant green, lurched to a halt on the access path, far too close to the flower beds Elias had just finished tending. Officer Miller, a man whose presence always seemed to precede him, like a cold draft emerged from the driver's side. His uniform was sharply pressed, his sunglasses obscuring his eyes, but the set of his jaw, the slight sneer that seemed permanently etched on his lips, conveyed an immediate and palpable arrogance. Miller's gaze swept the park, dismissing the few scattered individuals before settling with an unnerving intensity on Elias. Elias felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen Miller around, had witnessed his brusque, dismissive interactions with others who, like Elias, didn't quite fit the Glenview mold. He straightened up, his tools resting beside him, his expression carefully neutral. "You." "Landscaper," Miller barked, his voice carrying an unnecessary volume that made Mrs. Gable flinch slightly on her bench. He didn't approach, just stood by, his car, one hand resting near the butt of his holstered weapon. "What are you doing loitering around here?" Elias swallowed, keeping his tone even. "I work here, officer, for Glenview Park's maintenance. I'm just finishing up for the day." He gestured towards his cart, laden with trimmers, rakes, and bags of clippings. Miller's eyes, hidden behind the reflective lenses, seemed to narrow. Further. "Work here, huh? Funny, I didn't see any work getting done. Just saw you casing the place. This neighborhood's had a string of break-ins lately. People like you, hanging around, looking suspicious." The accusation, baseless and laced with an unspoken prejudice, stung Elias. "Suspicious? I'm wearing my uniform, officer. My truck is parked by the main entrance, clearly marked. I've been here since 7 this morning." His voice, though quiet, held a tremor of indignation he couldn't quite suppress. He thought of the hours he'd poured into this park, the care he took with every plant, every pathway. To be reduced to a suspicious person by this man's snap judgment felt like a desecration. "Don't get smart with me," Miller snapped, taking a few aggressive steps forward, closing the distance. The scent of cheap cologne and an underlying metallic tang, perhaps from the gun oil, reached Elias. "I asked what you were doing. Finishing up isn't an answer. What exactly were you finishing up?" His gaze flicked over Elias's dusty boots, his work-stained hands, lingering for a moment on the faded logo of the maintenance company on his shirt, as if it were itself evidence of some wrongdoing. Mrs. Gable, forgotten by Miller but an acute observer, watched with growing unease. The book in her lap was now clutched tightly, her knuckles white. She knew Elias, not by name perhaps, but by his quiet diligence, the way he always made sure the benches were clear of leaves, the faint, off-key whistle that sometimes accompanied his work. This was wrong. This felt deeply, intrinsically wrong. Miller was a predator circling, and Elias, for all his quiet strength, seemed like a lamb caught in the open. The officer's posture, the jut of his chin, the deliberate way he flexed his hand near his sidearm. It was all a performance of dominance, designed to intimidate, to crush any hint of resistance before it could even form. Elias could feel the eyes of other park-goers, a few curious, most quickly averting their gazes, not wanting to be drawn into whatever ugliness was unfolding. That, too, was a familiar feeling, the isolation that came with being singled out. Miller took another step, his shadow falling over Elias. Let's see some identification. And maybe you can explain why someone reported a man matching your description trying a back gate over on Elm Street not 20 minutes ago. Elm Street was 3 blocks away, a street of imposing Tudors and manicured hedges, a world away from the small apartment Elias shared with his sister. He hadn't been anywhere near Elm Street. The knot in Elias's stomach tightened into a cold fist of dread. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that logic and truth would be insufficient weapons against this man. He reached slowly for his back pocket, acutely aware of Miller's gaze tracking his every movement. The officer's lips curled into a smirk, as if he'd already decided the outcome of this encounter, and Elias was merely a formality on the path to a pre-drawn conclusion. From her bench, Mrs. Gable's gentle expression had hardened into one of sharp disapproval. She shifted slightly, her eyes fixed on Miller, a silent judgment in her steady gaze. The sun, now lower, painted the scene in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop to an ugly drama. Elias carefully extracted his worn leather wallet, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to project an air of calm he didn't feel. Inside, his driver's license, a few precious dollars, and a faded photograph of his younger sister Maria on her graduation day. He handed the license to Miller, who snatched it with a dismissive air. The officer glanced at it, then back at Elias, his expression unchanged. "Elias Vance, huh? You live over in the West End, don't you? Long way from home to be working." The implication was clear. People from the West End didn't belong in Glenview, not unless they were causing trouble. "The company has contracts all over the city, officer," Elias stated, his voice strained but holding steady. He had to remain calm, had to believe that the truth would somehow prevail. But Miller's demeanor offered little reassurance. He was like a man playing a game where he made all the rules and changed them at will. "Right, contracts," Miller scoffed, tapping the license against his palm. "You know, Vance, we've been looking for someone who fits your profile. Been a lot of tools going missing from construction sites, garden sheds getting broken into. Easy targets for someone who knows how to blend in, look like they belong." He gestured vaguely with the license. "Someone who knows how to handle tools." Elias felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but he forced it down. Losing his temper would only play into Miller's hands. "I am a landscaper, officer. I use my tools for my job. I have never stolen anything in my life." His gaze met Miller's, unwavering, a spark of defiance igniting in their depths. He could feel the weight of Mrs. Gable's attention, a silent, unseen support that strangely gave him a sliver of courage. Miller's lip curled. "That's what they all say." He made a show of examining the license again, then with a sudden, sharp movement, he reached out and grabbed Elias's arm. "All right, Vance, I think we need to have a little chat down at the station, get a few things cleared up." The grip was like iron, bruising. Elias tensed, a protest dying on his lips as Miller twisted his arm behind his back with practiced, painful efficiency. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet park. "You have the right to remain silent," Miller recited, his voice flat and bored, the words a mockery of justice. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Elias was roughly guided towards the cruiser, his mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. He saw his cart, his tools, the neatly trimmed lawn, symbols of his honest labor now forming the backdrop to his humiliation. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, a crushing weight of injustice. This was how it happened, how lives were derailed by prejudice and abuse of power. He was being arrested for what? For being in the wrong place, with the wrong skin tone, in front of the wrong cop? As Miller shoved him towards the back seat, Elias caught one last glimpse of Mrs. Gable. Her face was pale, her expression one of stunned disbelief and a dawning, fierce anger. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that instant Elias felt a flicker, not of hope, but of shared outrage. Then the car door slammed shut, encasing him in the sterile, unwelcoming scent of vinyl and disinfectant. He thought of Maria, how worried she would be. He thought of his reputation, so carefully built, now threatened by this arbitrary act. If Elias Vance wins this, if this nightmare somehow ends and his name is cleared, everyone who likes this video is going to have their dream summer. The thought, absurd and desperate, flashed through his mind as the cruiser pulled away, leaving the serene park and its silent witness behind. He closed his eyes, the Miranda rights still echoing hollowly in his ears, a prelude to a descent he couldn't control. The precinct was a symphony of harsh sounds, the clatter of keyboards, the incessant ringing of phones, loud, indifferent voices, the distant clang of a cell door. Elias was processed with a dehumanizing efficiency. His fingerprints were taken, his photo snapped under a glaring, unflattering light. His worn work belt, the one his father had given him, was confiscated along with his shoelaces and his wallet, its meager contents inventoried with a bored detachment by a desk sergeant, whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl. Miller, meanwhile, swaggered through the station, occasionally glancing towards Elias with a look of smug satisfaction, as if he'd just landed a prize catch. He was currently at a desk, animatedly describing the arrest to a younger, less jaded-looking officer who listened with a mixture of deference and, Elias thought he detected, a hint of unease. "Yeah, caught him red-handed casing those mansions on Elm," Miller was saying, his voice carrying easily over the station's din. "Classic M.O. poses as a worker, then B&E when no one's looking. These guys are getting bolder, I tell you," Elias felt a fresh wave of despair. Lies. All lies. He was led to a small, windowless interrogation room, the air thick with the stale scent of old cigarette smoke and fear. A single metal table and 2 chairs were bolted to the floor. The walls were a drab, institutional green marred with scuffs and faint, unidentifiable stains. He sat, his cuffed hands resting on the cold metal of the table. Every instinct screamed at him to protest, to shout his innocence, but a deeper, more primal instinct urged caution. He was in Miller's world now, and Miller held all the cards. An hour passed. Then another. The silence in the small room was broken only by the muffled sounds from outside and the frantic thumping of Elias's own heart. He replayed the encounter in the park over and over, searching for something he could have done differently, said differently. But there was nothing. He had been polite, cooperative, truthful. It hadn't mattered. Meanwhile, in the quiet serenity of Glenview Park, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Mrs. Eleanor Gable sat on her bench, no longer observing the squirrels or the fading light. Her book lay forgotten beside her. Her gentle, grandmotherly demeanor had been replaced by a steely resolve. The image of Elias Vance, his face a mask of confusion and quiet dignity, being manhandled by that brutish officer, was seared into her mind. She had seen Miller's type before, bullies who hid behind a badge, men who mistook authority for righteousness. She knew injustice when she saw it, and this was a particularly ugly, blatant example. She reached into her handbag, her movements precise and unhurried, and retrieved her mobile phone. A simple, older model, not one of the sleek smartphones so many carried. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger stopping on a name. Thomas. She pressed the call button, listening to the ringing tone, her gaze fixed on the spot where Elias had been arrested, as if willing the universe to correct the wrong that had occurred there. "Grandma, is everything all right?" The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, tinged with a slight concern that always surfaced when she called unexpectedly. Thomas Gable, her grandson, the state attorney general. A good boy, she'd always thought, even if his job sometimes made him sound a little too much like a lawyer. "Thomas, dear," she began, her voice calm but firm, devoid of its usual cheerful lilt. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've just witnessed something quite disturbing." And then, with clarity and a meticulous attention to detail that would have impressed any courtroom observer, Eleanor Gable recounted everything she had seen. Officer Miller's aggressive demeanor, the flimsy pretext for the stop, Elias Vance's polite attempts to explain himself, the unwarranted arrest, the officer's dismissive attitude. She omitted nothing, her voice a quiet testament to the truth. She didn't raise her voice, didn't embellish. She simply laid out the facts, her moral outrage a simmering undercurrent beneath the composed narrative. Thomas Gable listened, his initial casual concern slowly morphing into focused attention. He knew his grandmother. She was not prone to exaggeration or flights of fancy. She was a woman of keen observation and unshakable integrity. If she said something was wrong, it was undoubtedly, unequivocally wrong. He pictured her, small and seemingly frail, sitting on her park bench, yet possessing a moral compass as true as north. When she spoke of the landscaper, he could hear the genuine respect in her voice for the man's quiet dignity. When she described Officer Miller, a chill of distaste ran down his spine. He called the man Vance. Thomas, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice tight with remembered indignation. Elias Vance. He was just doing his job, a job he clearly takes pride in. And that officer, he treated him like dirt. He twisted his arm, put handcuffs on him like he was some hardened criminal. There was no reason for it, none at all. It was prejudice, Thomas, plain and simple, and abuse of power. Thomas leaned back in his office chair, the city lights twinkling far below his window. He rubbed his temples. His grandmother didn't call him at the office often, and never about something like this. This wasn't a minor complaint about a noisy neighbor or a pothole. This was an accusation of serious police misconduct, witnessed firsthand by one of the most credible people he knew. "Grandma," he said, his voice now serious, "are you absolutely certain about what you saw? About the officer's behavior?" "Thomas, I may be old, but my eyes and my mind are as sharp as they ever were," Eleanor replied, a touch of asperity creeping into her tone. "I know what I saw, and I know it was wrong. That young man, Mr. Vance, he looked so lost, so helpless. Someone needs to help him. That officer, Miller, he needs to be held accountable." Her voice softened slightly. "You're the Attorney General. Thomas, if you can't see that justice is done here, who can?" The question hung in the air between them, a gentle but undeniable challenge. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness for his grandmother, and a corresponding anger towards this Officer Miller. He also felt the weight of his office, the responsibility that came with it. "All right, Grandma," he said, his decision made. "Tell me the name of the precinct if you know it, and describe Officer Miller again for me." He picked up a pen, his legal mind already sifting through the information, formulating a plan. He would make some calls, discreetly at first. He wouldn't charge in, all guns blazing, but he would certainly look into this. His grandmother's unwavering conviction was enough to light a fire under him. He knew that sometimes the most unassuming voices carried the most profound truths, and Eleanor Gable, sitting on a park bench, had just become a powerful advocate for a man she barely knew, armed with nothing but her integrity and a belief in simple fairness. The system was designed to protect people like Elias Vance, not to victimize them. It was his job to ensure it did. Back in the sterile interrogation room, Elias shivered, though the room wasn't particularly cold. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of an unseen clock amplifying his anxiety. He tried to focus, to think clearly, but fear was a fog clouding his thoughts. He heard footsteps approaching, then the scrape of a key in the lock. The door opened and Officer Miller strolled in, followed by the younger officer Elias had seen earlier, whose name tag read Davies. Miller smirked, dropping a thin file folder onto the table. It landed with a thud that seemed to echo Elias's sinking heart. "All right, Vance," Miller began, leaning back in his chair, radiating a smug confidence. "We've had a little chat about you. Seems that report about Elm Street was pretty accurate. Witness saw a guy, dark hair, medium build, work clothes, messing with a gate. Sounds a lot like you, doesn't it?" Elias shook his head, his voice hoarse. "No, sir. I told you. I was in the park all day. I never went near Elm Street. Whoever this witness is, they're mistaken or they're not telling the truth." He looked from Miller to Davies, hoping to see a flicker of doubt, of fairness, in the younger officer's eyes. Davies shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the file on the table, avoiding Elias's plea. Miller chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, they're telling the truth, Vance. Why would they lie? You, on the other hand, you've got every reason to lie. You're facing serious charges here. Breaking and entering attempted burglary. That's prison time, my friend." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But maybe we can make a deal. You cooperate, tell us who you're working with, because guys like you never work alone. Maybe we can talk to the DA, get you a lighter sentence. Otherwise..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken, but potent. Elias felt a cold despair wash over him. Miller wasn't interested in the truth. He was building a narrative, and Elias was being forced into the role of the villain. "I'm not working with anyone," Elias insisted, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to control it. "Because I didn't do anything. There's no deal to make because I'm innocent." He thought of his sister, Maria, her bright, hopeful face. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't confess to something he didn't do, no matter the pressure. His integrity was all he had left. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Playing tough, huh? We'll see how long that lasts." He nodded to Davies. "Take his statement, the full version this time. And Vance," he added, his voice laced with malice, "don't think for a second you're fooling anyone." With that, he pushed himself up from the chair and strode out of the room, leaving Elias alone with Officer Davies and the chilling weight of the false accusations. Davies hesitantly picked up a pen and a notepad, his expression troubled. For the first time, Elias felt a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the oppressive atmosphere. Davies didn't have Miller's venomous certainty. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a sliver of humanity there, a chance that someone might actually listen. But the file on the table, Miller's fabricated story, felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. Thomas Gable disconnected the call with his grandmother, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Eleanor Gable was not one for theatrics. Her descriptions of Officer Miller's conduct and Elias Vance's undeserved plight painted a stark picture of injustice. He swiveled in his high-backed leather chair, the panoramic view of the city at night a blur as his mind raced. His grandmother's final words, "If you can't see that justice is done here, who can?" resonated deeply. It wasn't just a grandmother's plea. It was a direct challenge to the very core of his responsibilities. He tapped his pen against his desk blotter, the rhythmic click a counterpoint to the urgent thoughts coursing through his mind. Glenview Park fell under the jurisdiction of the 17th Precinct. He knew the captain there, a man named Henderson, generally a decent sort, though perhaps a bit too reliant on old-school policing methods. This Officer Miller, however, sounded like a different breed altogether. He made his first call not to Captain Henderson, but to his own chief investigator, a seasoned ex-detective named Marcus Thorne, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his ability to unearth buried truths. "Marcus," Thomas began, his voice low and serious, "I have a situation I need you to look into very quietly. 17th Precinct. An arrest made this afternoon in Glenview Park. A landscaper, name of Elias Vance. Arresting officer is a Miller, badge number unknown for now. My source is unimpeachable." He didn't elaborate on his grandmother's involvement. Marcus wouldn't ask. "The allegation is wrongful arrest, prejudicial behavior, possibly fabrication of evidence. I need to know everything about this Vance, and everything about this Officer Miller. Quickly, and off the books for now." Marcus, on the other end, absorbed the information without comment, his mind already cataloging the steps he would take. "Understood, Mr. Gable. I'll get right on it. Vance and Miller. Got it." The line went dead. Thomas knew Marcus would be thorough. He would check Vance's priors, if any, and Miller's service record, any commendations, any complaints. He'd likely have a discreet source within the 17th who could provide some initial ground truth. While Marcus began his subtle inquiries, Thomas made another call, this time to a trusted junior attorney in his own office, Sarah Chen, known for her sharp legal mind and unwavering ethical compass. "Sarah, I may have a delicate situation brewing. I need you to be ready to move on a potential civil rights violation, possibly a habeas corpus petition if it comes to that. I'll brief you more fully as I get information, but it involves an arrest at the 17th. Keep your evening clear." Having set these initial wheels in motion, Thomas allowed himself a moment of reflection. His grandmother's call had shaken him. It was one thing to read reports of police misconduct, to strategize policy changes from the lofty heights of the AG's office. It was another entirely to have it land so personally, so vividly in his lap. He thought of Elias Vance, a man he'd never met, yet whose predicament now felt intensely real. The underdog narrative his grandmother had painted resonated with a fundamental sense of fairness. He found himself hoping Marcus would find nothing on Vance and a whole laundry list of issues with Miller. It was a bias, he knew, but one rooted in his grandmother's conviction. Back at the 17th Precinct, Officer Davies was taking Elias's statement. Unlike Miller, Davies was quiet, his questions perfunctory, almost hesitant. He wrote down Elias's account of his day, arriving at the park, the specific tasks he'd performed, his interaction with Miller, in a neat, methodical script. Elias, sensing a less hostile audience, spoke clearly and earnestly, detailing his movements, his lack of any involvement in any crime on Elm Street or anywhere else. He stressed that his tools were for his work, that his presence in the park was legitimate. My supervisor, Mr. Henderson, no relation to the captain, I think. He can confirm my hours, my work orders for today, Elias said, his voice regaining some of its strength. My sister Maria, she knows I was working. I called her at lunchtime. He provided their contact numbers. Davies nodded, jotting down the information. He seemed to be genuinely listening, a stark contrast to Miller's aggressive dismissiveness. There was a weariness in Davies's eyes, a hint of disillusionment that Elias, even in his own distress, could perceive. Perhaps Davies had seen, too, much of Miller's brand of policing. And this witness on Elm Street, Elias continued. Can I know who it is? What exactly did they say they saw? Davies hesitated, glancing towards the closed door as if expecting Miller to burst in. The report. It's still being compiled. Officer Miller took the initial statement. He paused. Look, Mr. Vance, I'm just taking down your side of the story. That's my job. His tone wasn't unkind, but it offered little in the way of active help. He was a cog in the machine, albeit a less abrasive one. When Davies finally finished, he escorted Elias not to a holding cell, but back to a small, stark, waiting area near the booking desk. Wait here, he said, then disappeared into the maze of offices. Elias was left alone with his thoughts, the handcuffs a cold, heavy reminder of his predicament. He saw other officers pass by, some giving him curious glances, others ignoring him completely. The weight of the institution felt immense, impersonal, and crushingly powerful. He clung to the small hope that Davies might actually verify his alibi, that Mr. Henderson or Maria might be contacted. But the image of Miller's sneering face, the baseless accusations, kept replaying in his mind, threatening to extinguish that fragile ember. He wondered if Mrs. Gable was still in the park, if she had seen him driven away. Her silent disapproval of Miller had been a small comfort. He had no idea that her disapproval had already set in motion forces far beyond the confines of the 17th Precinct, forces that were, even now, beginning to shift the balance of power. The fluorescent lights of the 17th Precinct hummed with an indifferent monotony as Elias Vance waited, perched on the edge of a hard plastic chair. Hours seemed to have bled into one another, each tick of the large institutional clock on the wall, a small hammer blow against his dwindling reserves of hope. He'd seen Officer Davies a couple of times, scurrying past with files, avoiding eye contact. Miller, thankfully, had been conspicuously absent, probably relishing his version of a successful bust. Elias tried to focus on Maria, on the small garden he was helping her plant on their tiny apartment balcony. He pictured the stubborn tomato seedlings, pushing their way towards the sun, a small, everyday miracle of persistence. He needed some of that persistence now. Suddenly, the precinct's main doors swished open, and a different kind of presence entered the bustling space. Two men, both dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits that spoke of authority far exceeding that of a beat cop, stepped inside. The taller of the two, with a calm, assessing gaze and an air of quiet command, was Thomas Gable. Beside him, slightly older, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, was Marcus Thorne. They didn't stride in, with arrogance, but with a focused purpose that seemed to cut through the station's chaotic energy. The desk sergeant, who had been loudly complaining about the quality of the coffee, abruptly fell silent, his eyes widening slightly as he took in their attire and demeanor. These were not your average citizens lodging a complaint. Thomas approached the desk, his expression polite but firm. "Good evening, Sergeant. I'm Thomas Gable, from the Attorney General's office. This is my chief investigator, Marcus Thorne. We're here to speak with a Mr. Elias Vance, who we understand was brought in earlier today by an Officer Miller." The sergeant, flustered, fumbled with some papers on his desk. The name Attorney General had an immediate, galvanizing effect. Yes, sir. Mr. Gable. Vance. Yes. He's right over there." He gestured vaguely towards Elias. Thomas's gaze found Elias, who looked up, startled by the sudden shift in the station's atmosphere. Elias saw two men in expensive suits looking directly at him, their expressions unreadable but intense. A new kind of anxiety, mixed with a sliver of bewildered hope, fluttered in his chest. Who were these men? Before the sergeant could say more, Officer Miller emerged from a side office, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. He stopped short when he saw Thomas and Marcus, a flicker of surprise, then suspicion, crossing his face. Well, what have we got here? Slumming it, are we, counselor?" Miller said, his tone attempting bravado, though a slight tremor in his voice betrayed an underlying unease. He clearly didn't recognize Thomas Gable by sight, but the expensive suits and the mention of the AG's office were enough to put him on alert. Thomas turned to Miller, his gaze cool and steady. "Officer Miller, I presume? I'm Thomas Gable. We're here regarding the arrest of Mr. Elias Vance." He didn't raise his voice, but there was an undeniable steel beneath the calm tone. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Vance? Yeah, I brought him in. Good collar. Caught him casing a residential area. Resisted arrest, too." He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing with deliberate slowness, a petty display of defiance. Elias, hearing the blatant lie about resisting arrest, felt a surge of indignation. He started to speak. "I didn't resist." But a subtle gesture from Marcus Thorne, a slight shake of the head, silenced him. "Is that so, officer?" Thomas said, his voice remaining level. "Because my information suggests Mr. Vance is a landscaper, with no prior record, who was working in Glenview Park at the time of his arrest, and that the Elm Street incident you're attributing to him has some inconsistencies." Marcus had been remarkably swift. A quick check had confirmed Vance was clean. A discreet call to a contact at the Parks Department had verified his employment and his assignment to Glenview for the day. And the initial Elm Street report? It mentioned a suspect significantly taller and of a different build than Elias. Miller's bravado began to falter. The sandwich suddenly seemed less appealing. "Look, counselor, I'm a busy man. I made a good faith arrest based on probable cause. This Vance fits the description. He was acting suspicious. End of story." He tried to wave them off dismissively. "Actually, Officer Miller," Thomas continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping, slightly, but losing none of its intensity. "I think this is just the beginning of the story. We'd like to see your arrest report, your notes, and any witness statements pertaining to Mr. Vance's detention. Now, if you please." The "if you please" was a courtesy, not a request. The power dynamic in the room had palpably shifted. The desk sergeant was now watching with wide, apprehensive eyes. Other officers in the vicinity had paused their activities, sensing a confrontation that was far above their pay grade. Elias watched this exchange, stunned. The Attorney General? Here? For him? It felt surreal. He looked at Thomas Gable, a man who radiated an aura of calm authority, a stark contrast to Miller's belligerent insecurity. For the first time since Miller had first approached him in the park, Elias felt a genuine flicker of hope, fragile yet persistent, like one of Maria's tomato seedlings pushing through stubborn soil. This was no longer just his word against Miller's. The playing field, so heavily tilted against him, was beginning to level. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, had moved subtly to the side, his gaze sweeping the station, observing reactions, filing away details. He noted Officer Davies hovering nervously near a doorway, his expression a mixture of fear and something akin to relief. The air in the 17th precinct crackled with unspoken tension, the arrival of the Attorney General an unexpected tremor shaking the foundations of Miller's carefully constructed narrative of lies. Officer Miller's face, moments before a mask, of smug belligerence now cycled through a series of less confident expressions, surprise, annoyance, and a dawning, unwelcome flicker of apprehension. He was accustomed to his authority being absolute on his beat, his version of events rarely questioned, especially when it involved someone like Elias Vance. The sudden appearance of the Attorney General himself, flanked by a chief investigator, who looked like he could dissect a lie from 100 paces, was a development far outside Miller's usual experience. "My report is being processed," Miller blustered, avoiding Thomas Gable's direct gaze. "Standard procedure. You can request it through channels." He attempted to regain control, to reassert his authority within his own precinct. "We can," Thomas agreed, his tone deceptively mild. "Or, given the serious nature of the allegations we've received, which include potential civil rights violations and abuse of authority, you could provide it to us now, Officer Miller. It would certainly expedite matters." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Unless, of course, there's a reason you'd prefer not to." The implication was clear. Obstruction would not be viewed favorably. Marcus Thorne, silent until, now spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "We also have information that the initial description of the Elm Street prowler doesn't match Mr. Vance. Significantly different height, build. We'd be interested to see how your report reconciles that discrepancy, officer." Marcus's efficiency was unnerving. He'd already poked significant holes in Miller's flimsy justification before Miller even had a chance to fully commit his fabrications to an official document. Miller's eyes darted towards the desk sergeant, then to Officer Davies, who was now trying to make himself invisible in a nearby alcove. No support was forthcoming. He was on his own, and the ground beneath him was rapidly turning to quicksand. He licked his lips, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Look, I may have been mistaken about the Elm Street connection being definitive. It was preliminary. But Vance was still acting suspiciously in the park, loitering. He couldn't give a straight answer." The lies were becoming weaker, more desperate. Elias, listening to this, felt a surge of quiet vindication. Miller was backpedaling, his story unraveling under the calm, persistent pressure from Gable and Thorne. He met Thomas Gable's eyes for a moment, and saw not accusation, but a steady, professional scrutiny. It was a look that promised fairness, a concept that had felt utterly alien just an hour before. "Mr. Vance," Thomas said, turning his attention to Elias, his voice softening slightly. "My name is Thomas Gable. I'm the State Attorney General. We've received information concerning your arrest that gives us cause for concern. Would you be willing to tell us, in your own words, what happened this afternoon?" Elias nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of relief and residual fear. "Yes, sir, I would." He glanced at Miller, who was now visibly sweating under the fluorescent lights, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point on the floor. The hunter had, in a stunningly short period, become the hunted. Thomas gestured towards a quieter corner of the reception area. "Perhaps we can speak over here." As they moved, he subtly nodded to Marcus, who remained near Miller and the desk sergeant, a silent sentinel ensuring no further irregularities occurred. Captain Henderson, alerted by a panicked call from his desk sergeant, was reportedly on his way in, his evening plans abruptly canceled. The ripples from Mrs. Gable's park bench call were rapidly becoming a wave. Elias recounted his story, starting from his morning tasks in Glenview Park, his brief, silent acknowledgement of Mrs. Gable, to Miller's aggressive approach, the baseless accusations, and the humiliating arrest. He spoke simply, without embellishment, his quiet sincerity far more compelling than Miller's bluster. He mentioned his supervisor, his sister, the tools that were his livelihood, now likely locked away as evidence. He described Miller's taunts, his attempts to intimidate him into a confession for a crime he didn't commit. As Elias spoke, Thomas Gable listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. He made occasional notes in a small, leather-bound notebook, his questions precise and aimed at clarifying facts. He noted the worn state of Elias's work clothes, the ingrained dirt under his fingernails that even the precinct's harsh soap hadn't entirely removed, details that spoke of honest labor, not criminal enterprise. When Elias finished, there was a moment of silence. Thomas closed his notebook. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice firm but empathetic. "Thank you for your candor. Based on what you've told us, and the information Mr. Thorne has already gathered, it seems clear that a significant injustice has occurred here." He looked towards Miller, who was now being engaged in a low, tense conversation by a newly arrived, stern-faced Captain Henderson. "We will be looking into Officer Miller's conduct thoroughly. As for you, Mr. Vance, I believe your detention here is no longer warranted." The words, "no longer warranted," were like a balm to Elias's frayed nerves. Freedom. It was a simple word, but one that now held an almost sacred meaning. He looked at Thomas Gable, a man he had never met before this evening, a man who wielded immense power yet had chosen to use it to defend a stranger. "Thank you, sir," Elias managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He thought of Mrs. Gable, the old lady on the bench. He had no idea of her connection to this powerful man, but he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude towards her, the silent witness who had somehow, miraculously, set this chain of events in motion. The fight wasn't over, he sensed that. Miller would undoubtedly face an investigation, and Elias would likely need to provide further testimony. But the immediate nightmare, the feeling of being trapped and voiceless in a corrupt system, was lifting. The arrival of Thomas Gable had not just been an intervention, it had been a restoration of hope. The following morning, the stark fluorescent lights of the 17th Precinct were replaced by the soft, natural light filtering into Thomas Gable's spacious office. Elias Vance sat opposite the Attorney General, not in handcuffs, but as a man whose dignity was slowly being restored. He wore a clean, borrowed shirt, courtesy of a junior staffer in Gable's office, a small gesture that nonetheless felt significant. Marcus Thorne was also present, along with Sarah Chen, the sharp-eyed junior attorney Thomas had put on alert the previous evening. A tray with coffee and pastries sat untouched on the polished mahogany table between them. "Mr. Vance," Thomas began, his tone both professional and reassuring. "Firstly, I want to reiterate my sincere apologies for what you endured yesterday. No citizen should be subjected to that kind of treatment." Elias nodded, still finding it hard to fully process the rapid turn of events. "Thank you, Mr. Gable, for believing me, for stepping in." "It's my job to step in when the system fails," Thomas replied, a hint of weariness in his voice that spoke of long battles fought against injustice. "And yesterday, with Officer Miller, it appears the system not only failed, but was actively manipulated." He gestured to Sarah Chen. "Sarah will be working with you, Mr. Vance. We've already initiated a formal investigation into Officer Miller's conduct with the Internal Affairs Division and our own Civil Rights Unit. Your testimony will be crucial." Sarah Chen offered Elias a small, encouraging smile. "Mr. Vance, we'll need a comprehensive statement from you, detailing everything that happened. We'll also be speaking with your supervisor at the Parks Department, your sister, and of course, our primary witness, Mrs. Eleanor Gable." At the mention of Mrs. Gable, Elias looked up, a question in his eyes. "Mrs. Gable? The lady from the park? She called you?" Thomas allowed himself a slight smile. "Mrs. Gable is my grandmother, Mr. Vance. She was the one who alerted me to your situation. She has a very keen eye for injustice, and she doesn't hesitate to make her opinions known, even to the Attorney General." Elias was stunned. The quiet old lady on the bench, the one he'd exchanged polite nods with, was the Attorney General's grandmother? The unlikely nature of his rescue was almost overwhelming. It felt like something out of a story, a fabled Frames production perhaps, where the most unexpected person turns out to hold the key. Your grandmother, he repeated, a sense of awe in his voice. I don't know how to thank her. She'll be pleased to know you're all right, Thomas said warmly. She was very concerned. He then turned to Marcus. Marcus, what's the latest? On Miller. Marcus Thorne consulted his notes. Officer Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Captain Henderson at the 17th was cooperative, once he understood the gravity of the situation and the AG's direct involvement. Miller's initial report on your arrest, Mr. Vance, was, shall we say, creatively written. It conveniently omitted the discrepancies regarding the Elm Street suspect and exaggerated your alleged suspicious behavior. We've also started a preliminary review of Miller's service record. There are a couple of prior complaints, less serious, dismissed for insufficient evidence, but they paint a pattern of aggressive behavior and potential profiling. Elias listened, a cold anger mixing with his relief. Miller hadn't just made a mistake. He had deliberately tried to frame him, to ruin his life, perhaps to bolster his arrest statistics, or simply out of sheer malice and prejudice. The thought that this man might have done this to others, successfully, was deeply disturbing. We're also looking for the alleged witness on Elm Street, Marcus continued. The one Miller claimed saw you. So far, no one in that vicinity recalls reporting anything that precisely matches Miller's initial claims to you. The only actual report from that area yesterday described a much taller individual. It seems Miller may have conflated, or more, likely fabricated, parts of that to justify your detention. Sarah Chen leaned forward. Mr. Vance, it's important you understand that this process may take time. Officer Miller will have union representation, and he will likely try to defend his actions. But we are committed to seeing this through. Our goal is not just to clear your name completely, but to ensure Officer Miller is held accountable for his actions, so he cannot do this to anyone else. Elias nodded slowly. I understand. I'll do whatever is necessary. He thought of the humiliation, the fear, the crushing sense of helplessness. If his experience could prevent someone else from suffering the same, then the ordeal would have some meaning beyond his own suffering. He felt a new sense of purpose solidifying within him. He was no longer just a victim. He was a witness, a participant in the fight for justice. He was no longer the isolated underdog. He had powerful allies, brought together by the quiet courage of an old woman on a park bench. The path ahead might be challenging, but he was no longer walking it alone. The worn work boots he'd been forced to remove at the precinct felt like a distant memory. In their place, he felt a new, more solid grounding, a sense of agency he hadn't possessed before Miller's cruiser had shattered the park's tranquility. The investigation into Officer Miller's conduct moved with a speed and thoroughness that was unusual, largely due to the direct oversight of the Attorney General's office. Sarah Chen proved to be a meticulous and empathetic guide for Elias, patiently walking him through the process of giving formal statements, reviewing precinct logs, and identifying discrepancies. Elias, in turn, was a model witness, calm, clear, and unwavering in his account. His quiet dignity, which had so impressed Mrs. Gable and Thomas, also resonated with the internal affairs investigators, a stark contrast to the defensive bluster they were anticipating from Miller. Marcus Thorne's team delved deeper into Miller's past. The couple of prior complaints turned out to be more numerous than initially apparent, many informally lodged and quickly dismissed at the precinct level, never making it to IAD. A pattern of targeting minorities, of overly aggressive stops for minor or non-existent infractions, began to emerge. They interviewed Officer Davies, who, after much soul-searching and with the assurance of protection from retaliation, provided a damning account of Miller's behavior, not just with Elias, but in other instances. Davies described Miller's often derogatory language, his boasts about shaking up certain neighborhoods, and his tendency to escalate situations rather than de-escalate them. Davies confessed his own discomfort and fear of speaking out against a senior officer known for his vindictive streak. His testimony, though reluctant, painted a clear picture of a rogue officer operating with impunity for too long. Mrs. Eleanor Gable also gave her statement, not at a sterile office, but in her own comfortable living room over tea and biscuits with Thomas present. Her recollection was crystal clear. Her description of Miller's arrogance and Elias's polite restraint, delivered with a quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. She even remembered details Elias himself had forgotten in his distress. The way Miller had sneered when Elias mentioned his company, the aggressive stance he'd taken even before any words were exchanged. "That young man was minding his own business, doing his work and doing it well, I might add," she stated firmly, her gaze unwavering. Officer Miller saw what he wanted to see, not what was there. He judged a man by his appearance, not his character. That is not justice, Thomas. That is prejudice wearing a badge. Elias's supervisor at Glenview Park's maintenance, Mr. Henderson, no relation indeed to Captain Henderson, corroborated Elias's work schedule and praised his diligence and reliability. Elias Vance, one of my best men. Always on time, meticulous, never a lick of trouble. When I heard he'd been arrested, I couldn't believe it. Sounded completely out of character. That park, especially Mrs. Gable's corner, always looks immaculate thanks to him. The contrast between the mounting evidence against Miller and the consistent testimony supporting Elias's innocence became undeniable. Miller, through his union lawyer, stuck to his initial increasingly threadbare story, claiming Elias was evasive and matched a prowler description. But with no credible Elm Street witness materializing and Davies's testimony directly contradicting Miller's account of Elias resisting, Miller's defense began to crumble. He had underestimated Elias's quiet strength, underestimated the observant old lady on the bench, and most fatally, underestimated the lengths to which a concerned grandson, who happened to be the Attorney General, would go to uncover the truth. 4. Elias, these weeks were a strange mixture of anxiety and empowerment. He was back at work, the Glenview Park's maintenance company having been fully supportive once the AG's office had clarified the situation. His colleagues, initially shocked, rallied around him. He found that when he returned to Glenview Park, his interactions with the residents had subtly changed. There were more nods, more smiles, a sense of shared acknowledgement of the injustice he had faced. He even found a small bouquet of flowers left on his bench near the equipment shed one morning, with a simple anonymous note. "We're glad you're back." Mrs. Gable, from her usual spot, would offer him a brighter smile, a more deliberate nod. They still rarely spoke, but their silent understanding was deeper now, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. Elias also found a new voice. Encouraged by Sarah Chen, he began to understand that his story was not just his own, but represented a larger issue. He had always been a quiet man, content to let his work speak for him. But now, he realized that silence in the face of injustice was a luxury he could no longer afford, for himself or for others who might not be as fortunate as he had been to have an Attorney General's grandmother as a witness. He started attending community meetings, listening to others share their experiences, and slowly, tentatively, began to consider sharing his own. The ordeal had stripped away his naivety, but in its place, it was building a quiet, determined resolve. The tools in his hands still shaped the landscape, but the experience was reshaping him, forging a new kind of strength from the fire of his wrongful arrest. The internal affairs investigation, bolstered by the diligent work of Marcus, Thorne's team and Sarah Chen's legal acumen, moved towards its inevitable conclusion. The evidence against Officer Frank Miller was overwhelming. His fabricated report, the lack of any credible witness to corroborate his claims about Elias Vance on Elm Street, Officer Davies's damning testimony about Miller's general conduct and specific actions that day, and Mrs. Eleanor Gable's unimpeachable eyewitness account created a compelling case for severe disciplinary action and potentially criminal charges for falsifying a police report and official oppression. The initial string of break-ins Miller had alluded to as a pretext for targeting Elias turned out to be largely exaggerated, a convenient narrative he'd used before to justify his aggressive patrolling in affluent neighborhoods when encountering individuals he deemed out of place. The climax of this particular chapter of Elias's life didn't occur in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in the more subdued, yet equally impactful setting of a police disciplinary hearing. It was a closed session, but Thomas Gable had ensured Elias was permitted to attend, accompanied by Sarah Chen. Miller was present, along with his union representative, his face a stony mask, a stark contrast to the smug arrogance he had displayed in Glenview Park and later at the precinct. Captain Henderson of the 17th Precinct was also there, his expression grim. He had been forced to confront the rot within his own command, a bitter pill to swallow. Key testimonies were summarized. Mrs. Gable's clear, concise statement. Officer Davies's reluctant but truthful account of Miller's on-scene behavior and subsequent falsifications. Elias's own calm, dignified recounting of his ordeal. The discrepancies in Miller's report were laid bare, his attempts to link Elias to the Elm Street incident exposed as a deliberate fabrication. The board members, seasoned police officials and civilian oversight representatives, listened intently. The weight of evidence was palpable in the room. Miller's representative offered a weak defense, attempting to paint Elias as uncooperative and Miller as a proactive officer making a judgment call in a high-crime area. But the carefully constructed case by the AG's office left little room for doubt. When it was Elias's turn to give a final impact statement, he stood, not with anger, but with a quiet, resolute dignity. "That afternoon," he began, his voice steady, "Officer Miller didn't just take my freedom for a few hours. He tried to take my name, my reputation, my livelihood. He judged me not by my actions, but by his own prejudices. I was lucky that Mrs. Gable saw what happened. I was lucky that her grandson was in a position to help. But justice shouldn't depend on luck." He looked directly at the board members. "How many others has Officer Miller, or officers like him, treated this way, who weren't so lucky? Who didn't have a witness, or a voice, or the resources to fight back?" His words, simple and heartfelt, resonated more powerfully than any legal argument. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for all those who had been silenced, dismissed, or railroaded by abusive power. The board deliberated for what felt like an eternity to Elias, though it was only a couple of hours. Finally, they returned. The chairman, a veteran, officer with a face etched by years of service, read the findings. Officer Frank Miller was found guilty on multiple counts: conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, falsification of an official report, and violation of departmental policy regarding biased policing. The recommendation, which Captain Henderson immediately stated he would uphold, was termination of employment from the police force, effective immediately. Furthermore, the findings would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges. A wave of relief washed over Elias, so profound it almost buckled his knees. It was over. His name was officially unequivocally cleared. Miller, his face now ashen, was escorted from the room, no longer an officer of the law, but a disgraced man facing the consequences of his actions. Captain Henderson approached Elias and Thomas Gable. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice heavy, "on behalf of the department, I offer you our sincerest apologies. What happened to you should never have happened. We will be reviewing our training and oversight procedures to try and ensure it doesn't happen again." He then looked at Thomas. "Mr. Gable, thank you for bringing this to our attention with such clarity." Thomas nodded. "Justice was served today, Captain. For Mr. Vance, the work of ensuring it's served every day for everyone continues." He placed a supportive hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did well, Elias. You stood your ground and you spoke your truth." Elias looked at Thomas, then at Sarah Chen, their faces reflecting a shared sense of somber victory. The system so often criticized for its failings had, in this instance, been forced to work. Not perfectly, not without immense effort, and a fortunate confluence of circumstances, but it had worked. The public confrontation had occurred, not in a park or on a street, but in the quiet, formal setting of a hearing room, yet its impact was just as decisive. The badge that Miller had used as a shield for his prejudice had been stripped away, a symbolic and tangible victory for truth and accountability. In the weeks that followed the disciplinary hearing and Miller's termination, a sense of quiet normalcy began to return to Elias Vance's life, yet it was a normalcy subtly changed, imbued with a new layer of meaning. The news of Miller's dismissal, and the subsequent announcement from the district attorney's office that they were indeed pursuing criminal charges for official misconduct and perjury spread through the community. For many, it was a heartening sign that accountability was possible, even when it involved a police officer. Elias found that people looked at him differently now, not with pity, but with a quiet respect. He had faced down injustice and, with crucial help, had prevailed. He continued his work at Glenview Park's maintenance, his hands once again tending to the earth, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of planting, pruning, and nurturing. His favorite corner of Glenview Park, near Mrs. Gable's bench, felt particularly peaceful. He and Eleanor Gable now exchanged more than just nods. Sometimes she would engage him in brief conversations, asking about his sister Maria or the progress of the roses he was tending. Her sharp eyes still held their keen observational power, but now they also held a warmth and a shared understanding that transcended words. One afternoon, she handed him a small, neatly wrapped package. "A little something, Mr. Vance," she said, her smile genuine. "For your courage." Inside was a first edition copy of a book on landscape design, a thoughtful and personal gift. Elias was deeply touched. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can never thank you enough. Not just for this, but for everything." Eleanor patted his hand. "Nonsense, dear boy. You were the courageous one. I merely made a phone call. It's what any decent person should do when they see wrong being done." But Elias knew it was more than that. It was her unwavering conviction, her refusal to stay silent, that had been the catalyst for everything. Thomas Gable made sure to follow up with Elias, ensuring he had access to any support services he might need. He also used Elias's case, with his permission, as a powerful example in his advocacy for stronger police oversight and improved community relations initiatives. The Vance case, as it was becoming known within legal circles, served as a stark reminder of the potential for abuse within the system and the critical importance of civilian vigilance and robust internal affairs. Officer Davies, who had testified against Miller, found himself treated with a wary respect by some colleagues and outright hostility by others, but he stood by his decision, quietly encouraged by Captain Henderson, who was now actively trying to foster a more ethical culture within the 17th Precinct. The change was slow, incremental, but it was a start. Elias, too, found his voice growing stronger. He began volunteering with a local community group that worked to bridge the gap between residents and law enforcement, sharing his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience and the importance of speaking out. He discovered a quiet eloquence he never knew he possessed. He wasn't an activist in the traditional sense, but a storyteller, his narrative a powerful tool for fostering understanding and change. His experience had been harrowing, but it had also forged in him a new sense of purpose. He still loved the feel of the earth in his hands, the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended garden, but now he also understood the importance of cultivating justice, of tending to the often neglected landscape of human rights. One sunny Saturday, months later, Elias was working in his sister Maria's small balcony garden. The tomato plants, once tiny seedlings, were now heavy with ripening fruit. Maria watched him, a proud smile on her face. "You seem different, Elias," she said softly. "Stronger." Elias paused, wiping a smudge of soil from his cheek. He looked out over the city, the view from their modest apartment a world away from the manicured lawns of Glenview. "Maybe I am," he said, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I learned that even in the darkest moments, there can be light, if you look for it. And sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places, like an old lady on a park bench." He smiled, a genuine heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. He was no longer just Elias Vance, the quiet landscaper. He was Elias Vance, a survivor, a witness, and a quiet force for good, his life a testament to the enduring power of truth and the profound impact of one person's courage to make a call, and another's courage to answer it. The scars of his ordeal remained, but they were now interwoven with a strength and a hope that defined his path forward.